thinking about that, my background is in environmental history, and my first book was about the history of wetlands in the United States. And in the course of research for that book, I realized that a tremendous number of wetlands, more than half of America's wetlands had been destroyed, and a lot of them had been destroyed owing to agriculture. They'd been converted to farms. And so I was just starting to pay attention to the relationship between our food system and the environment more and more. And then I just started to hear more and more news about things that were happening. Not only were wetlands being converted to farms, the prime farmland was being converted to suburbia, aquifers were being depleted to irrigate crops. I realized that when I went to the supermarket to shop, it was as if I entered an entirely different world. Food was plentiful, cheap, and colorful, and you go into the supermarket and you see Aunt Jemima and Betty Crocker, and food as familiar as it's ever been, but somehow I just started to pay attention and realize, it was as if a shift happened, that all these foods on all the shelves had real stories, and I knew absolutely none of them. And I just was struck by the utter absurdity of that situation that so many of us find ourselves in, which is that we don't know anything about about the food that we eat, that we put into our own bodies, and we think it's totally normal. Really, I would say the fundamental reason that we did lose knowledge of our foods had to do with urbanization and industrialization. And what happened was in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, cities started to grow in America, and my book focuses on the United States history, but it happened in different places all around the world, and it's still happening. When people move to cities, they're no longer raising their own food. They're no longer engaged in a system of barter or of a local food system that used to be. And to supply people in cities, all sorts of new food technologies were invented. And as this happened, we really had to go from this system that happened before, the traditional ways of knowing our foods, knowing them directly, knowing stories of where they came from, knowing them through our senses, to a new way of knowing our foods, which means we had to rely on things like the label on the package or the brand name. And it's an interesting question. How do we supply food to cities? And when we first started supplying foods to cities, there were, I think there's some interesting things to learn from that era. For example, there used to be rings of farmlands right around cities. And so people were getting a lot of local vegetables coming into cities. And at that time, we didn't have cars yet, so we were using horses, and so there was a lot of manure in cities that went out to fertilize farms. And so there were these different kinds of ecological and energy systems at that point. And I think those are the kinds of things people are looking at again today as we're thinking, we want to have more local foods because they tend to be healthier and more nutritious if you can eat foods that are closer to where you live. We can have a more diversified economy and a more secure food system if our food is not all coming from distant places. There's so many great opportunities that weren't possible just a few years ago. One of the fun things people can do is just start shopping at farmers markets. In the 1980s, there were something like under a dozen farmers markets in America. Now there's over 3,000. They're in cities all over America. And if there aren't farmers markets in cities, people are so interested that they try to figure out how to get them. And when they figure out how to get them, they confront the issue of, oh gosh, we don't have enough farms around here, or how do we support farmers? And it's just a wonderful thing that can happen that helps people to connect to their place and to their community in a different way. So that's a great thing. And one of the fun things about shopping in farmers markets is you can talk to farmers, you can understand the seasonality of your food, you can understand, why it is that some things come ripe at one time, but because those are things we've kind of forgotten. When you shop at a supermarket, you don't realize, tomatoes are great in August and September, because in fact sometimes in supermarkets you're not really getting the ripe seasonal food because the system, the food system that supplies supermarkets is not necessarily oriented towards giving you the ripe seasonal food. It's oriented towards just getting things there all the time efficiently. And There's another really exciting movement that's happened, which is called community-supported agriculture, which is again happening all over the country. I think in the agricultural census of 2007, I think there were 12,000 CSAs. And basically what you do is people can sign up to sort of subscribe to a farm ahead of time, and you pay up front your farmer or your farm, and then all through the growing season you can get a box of fresh seasonal vegetables all through the year. And that's another great way to become more kitchen literate, because you get, again, you're getting fresh local produce, you're supporting agriculture right where you live. And so I think about it in two ways. One is it matters for consumers, or the people, those of us who are eating the foods, because having food come from local farms, from organic farms, is really much healthier. And so it's healthy for us as eaters. It helps us get excited about eating fresh foods. That's, we live in a time where we are basically having an epidemic of obesity in America, and it's because people are not eating healthily, and it's because we've kind of lost track of what really good food is. And so in that sense, we can be healthier. We can also enjoy our foods more because they taste better, or we can have just a richer experience as eaters. So that's a wonderful part about it. Also incredibly important, and as I alluded to earlier, this is how I got interested in it. Our food system now, our modern food system, has tremendous hidden costs of things like pollution, or things like farmers getting squeezed off the land because the economy of industrial agriculture tends to squeeze out small farms and make it only possible for the largest industrial farms to exist. And that has consequences for communities and for the environment. Where I live, I'll just give you an example. We have a number of wonderful small ranches and farms where that have been in families for 5 generations. And people who really care about the land, care about the rivers, they're tremendous stewards of the land. And yet they don't necessarily make enough money to be able to support themselves. They're land rich, but they're cash poor. And this has happened to farms all across America over the past 50 years. And I think ultimately it's important because we have gone through a period where agriculture has really been destructive to the environment. It's really been polluting. We haven't paid attention to these hidden costs. And for a long time we just kind of were told, oh, we can't do that. We have to use pesticides. We have to have this large scale agriculture because it's the only way we're going to feed everybody cheaply. Well, it turns out feeding everybody cheaply, it can make us all very unhealthy. That's not necessarily a good thing. And so raising these questions, talking about them, looking for better ways of doing things are all really neat things that are happening right now as a result of people paying attention. So I think it's tremendous to have something like the Year of Idaho Food. Of course, Idaho has a really rich history of agriculture. It also has a rich history of industrial agriculture. And so here at the beginning of the 21st century, the important questions are, well, what kind of food system and agriculture are we going to have into the future? In a place like Idaho, where there's a lot of rural communities still, there's a lot of traditional knowledge that's still around, which is something that's so important and has been lost in other places. And having that kind of knowledge is incredibly rich, and it can become the basis for new ways of doing things. I mean, I guess you could say they're old ways, but integrating the new and the old. So I think that's really powerful. Talked with some students this morning and met a young woman who grew up in a city, but here she's got friends on campus who grew up on farms in Idaho, and so she's gone and spent time there and learned how to do things like can vegetables from a garden. And I think when people have that set of skills, they also feel incredibly, they feel more powerful and more capable in a food system. When you learn how to grow your own food, have a garden, it's such a good feeling. It's such a different experience of being in the world. And so anyway, talking more about those things I think will be a wonderful thing for Idaho, and hopefully a lot of people will really enjoy it. And as far as Bon Appetit goes, I'm so impressed with the cafeteria here on campus and the idea of what Bon Appetit is doing. We can do a lot of things as individuals, but it really is going to take institutions to make changes in order to affect the larger food system. And it may not be possible for a catering service or food service to say, well, we're going to do everything 100% sustainable. But if they can start by saying, well, we're we're going to try to do 10%, source 10% of our foods locally, or 20%, and just kind of start asking that question, what can we do better? I mean, that's such a great example of something we can all do, because it may be intimidating to try to do everything ideally, and of course we can't necessarily do it all, but if we start trying to do things better, it's just so great that helps us to go in the direction we want to go.